haven't gathered by the video just saw, we're going to try and talk to you tonight about who Jesus is. And hopefully by the end of me talking, we'll all kind of understand a bit more about who he is to us. So millions of people believe in Jesus, and everyone believes different things about him. There's people think he was a prophet, others say he's the Messiah, and all sorts of things. But who's right and who's wrong about this? When Christians talk about it, they say the gospel is true, and so therefore saying that they believe Jesus was our saviour who came to die on the cross to free us from our sins. But what evidence is there to actually back this up? Because a lot of people say, well, it's a load of nonsense and you've got nothing to prove it. The Bible's an old book, you don't even know if it's true or not. It's thousands of years old. How do you know it's even been rewritten and messed about with just to, make it fit what you want to believe? But there is plenty of evidence to back this up. Now, most historians, including people without any religious beliefs, will back up that Jesus did exist. Most historians will not deny the facts that Jesus existed, he walked the earth, he was a real person, and he was alive. So to back up the Christian view of who we as Christians believe Jesus is, so I'm going to try to explain to you this evening. Now even sort of Roman historians, such as I can't say the name, Tacitus, thank you. Even is one of the old Roman historians who wrote about Jesus. And the way we can help to use some of that evidence and what the New Testament says is by using a scientific method called textual criticism, which basically means that to find out check the validity of something to see if it's actually true or not is you ask two questions, which is one, how quickly after the original was the earliest copy made of a document, and how many copies are there? So this Roman, a couple of Roman historians wrote sorry, what was the name again? Tacitus was written. There was a 1,000-year gap between the original copy and the first copy, and there were a total of 20 copies. So that's quite a few, and that's backed up by historians as a genuine artifact, and that's foolproof. And then there's Caesar's Gallic War, which has a 950-year gap between the original and the first copy, and a total of 9 or 10 copies in total. Now the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD, and the earliest copy we have is around 130 AD, and we have full manuscripts that date around AD 350. So at most, there's a 300-year gap, so less than that of the Roman historians, between the original and the first copies. And there aren't just 9 or 10 copies of these manuscripts kicking about. There are a total of 5,300 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and nearly over 9,000 other manuscripts, compared to sort of 9 or 10 of the others which are believed to be true. So the New Testament's got an awful lot of backing behind it to qualify it as an original, genuine document that has not been tampered with at all. So the New Testament, by far and away out of those, stands ahead of all the rest, and no even any historian would argue with that. So we know Jesus was definitely real, he definitely lived, and we know that the New Testament is an accurate record and hasn't been tampered with at all since it was originally written. But from that, how do we ascertain who Jesus was? Was he a teacher? Was he a prophet? Who was it? Well, we know Jesus was fully human, and he had experiences just like us. So he was born, he had emotions, he had an education, he was tempted by things, he worked, he suffered, he felt rejection, and he died. He was just like everyone else on the planet. He felt things and endured things and had experiences in life. And some people have different opinions about who Jesus was. And Billy Connolly has an opinion of who Jesus was, and he said this. He said, "I can't believe in Christianity, but I think Jesus was a wonderful man, and he was a great religious teacher." That's one person's opinion. So he thought, yeah, he's real, but he wasn't anything more than a good teacher. But he was a good teacher. That says Billy Connolly. Bono said this when he was asked, "Christ has his rank among the world's great thinkers. The Son of God, isn't that a bit far-fetched?" And he responded this. He said, "No, it's not far-fetched to me. Look, the secular response to the Christian story always goes like this. He was a great prophet, obviously he's a very interesting guy, but actually, Christ doesn't allow you that. He doesn't let you off the hook. Christ says, 'I am God incarnate.' So what are you left with is either Christ was who he said he was, or a complete nutcase." I'm not joking here. The idea that the entire course of civilization for over half the globe could have its fate changed and turned upside down by a nutcase, for me, that's far-fetched. But Bono thought it was far-fetched that actually the last 2,000 years of people believing in Jesus and living their life by what's written in the Bible being not true and all being led by some nutcase 2,000 years ago, he thinks that's far-fetched, and that it's not a far-fetched idea that actually he was the Son of God and he did come down to earth. But what evidence is there to suggest that he was actually more than a teacher like Billy Connolly thought? Well, first of all, who did Jesus think he was? Who did he think he was himself? Now it's true that Jesus did not go around saying, "I am God." He never went around saying, "I am God." He never claimed to actually be God himself. Although his teaching did centre around himself, and Jesus did say that it's through him we encounter God. So he never actually came to be God, but he said that we encounter and experience God through him. And in that, pointing to himself, he kind of pointed to God. Now, in every human heart, there's a hunger for something. I know for men it's mainly in their bellies, around 5 o'clock. But even men have hungers in their hearts. And Freud said that people are hungry for love. Okay, he wasn't Christian, not a Christian guy, and he said, that people are hungry for love. And Jesus can satisfy that need. Because he said himself, "I am the bread of life," and that he can satisfy those hungers. Because other people have tried to point away from Jesus over time, and they've said that that's the way, and that's the truth, and that's the way you do things, and that's what life's really about. When people talk about their worries and how they feel guilty about things, and people say that this is the remedy for that, and you can get this self-help book to tell you how to deal with that. But Jesus said that, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So Jesus taught that to receive him was to receive God, and to welcome Jesus was to welcome God into your life. And he said to have seen him was to have seen God. The second piece of evidence, other than that what he thought about himself, was his indirect claims. Jesus said a number of things which, although not direct claims to be God, show that he regarded himself as being in the same position as God. Because Jesus claimed to be able to forgive, which at the time was something that the religious Pharisees only believed that God could do. Forgiveness could only come from God. Nobody else, no human person could forgive, but only God could. And Jesus was going around saying, "Actually, no, I can forgive you." Which they didn't like at all. And he also claimed that he was going to be one to judge the world. So it was being quite outrageous at the time. And to the Pharisees, this was all blasphemy, and they didn't like that one bit. but they were his indirect claims to his connection to God. He directly claimed, though, after his resurrection, when Jesus appeared to his disciples, all but Thomas, who said, I can't believe unless I see for myself. I need to see the wounds in Jesus' hands and side, from the nails and spear, or I won't believe it. And then Jesus appears to them again, including Thomas this time, and he welcomes Thomas and shows him the wounds in his hands and in his side, and allows Thomas to ask his question and explore his doubts right up close. And Thomas, and he says this to Thomas, and he says, now, stop doubting and believe. And Thomas did that. He'd actually seen him himself. And in verse 28, Thomas actually says to Jesus, he says, my Lord and my God. So that was his direct claim to his connection to God. And not actually saying he was, but that he and God were in union with each other. And Jesus didn't try and correct him. He didn't say, no. He says, it's not my Lord and my God. He didn't correct him at all. He said to him, because you've seen me and you've believed, and blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. In other words, he was saying, you've finally got it, Thomas. You've got the point at last. He had to see it for himself to believe it, but he got the point. And then again, in John chapter 10, verse 30, Jesus says himself, he says, I and the Father are one. So he's not claiming to be God, Jesus isn't. He's not saying, I am God. He's saying that, he is one with God. Now, all sorts of people make all kinds of claims, and Jesus' claim to being one with God is quite a radical one. You know, people now are in psychiatric hospitals and are deluded because they think they're Napoleon or Elvis Presley or the Pope, or they think they're God, but they're not. But how can we test such claims? How can we test Jesus' claims to being one with God? And there are three logical possibilities. And number one is, it's not true, but Jesus didn't realise it, and didn't realise it wasn't true. In other words, Jesus was a nutter. He was off his head. Number two is that it wasn't true, and Jesus knew it wasn't true perfectly well, in which case Jesus was an imposter, and he knew what he was doing was wrong. That's the second option. The third option is that it is true, and Jesus actually was the Son of God. And C.S. Lewis put it like this. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any patronising nonsense about being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. But what evidence is there to support actually what he said, that he said he was the Son of God? Well, number one, there was his teaching. Jesus' teaching was acknowledged at the time to be the greatest teaching that had ever fallen from anyone's lips at all. And then one example of this is the Sermon on the Mount, which he taught to love your neighbour as yourself, to turn the other cheek, to love your enemies, and do to others what you would have do to you. So these were all that was his teaching, and I think it's not far to say that it's not really bad teaching. Sort of treating people the way you'd want to be treated. It's kind of a nice thing, isn't it? So now there's a chap called Eric Idle, who was one of the comedians behind the famous Monty Python films, and he said this about Jesus' teaching himself. And he's an atheist, and he said we looked for comedy in the Gospels. We looked to poke fun at Jesus for the things he said, but we couldn't. We found Jesus' teaching was brilliant. It all seemed to make sense. And So even people have tried to poke fun out of the gospel, and in doing so they found actually, they've learned for themselves that actually Jesus' teaching was pretty foolproof and bulletproof and pretty sound. So from that point of view, it probably wasn't insane. The second thing was his works. Now, some people have got this view of Christianity being pretty boring, but actually, if you follow some of the stories that involve Jesus, we can actually see it probably wasn't that boring to be around Jesus at all. Imagine yourselves going to a party and you've ran out of wine at about 8 o'clock in the evening. It's probably not going to be a very good situation. But imagine Jesus was at a party and they ran out of wine. And all they had was jars of water. So he turned them into wine, which is a pretty miraculous thing to happen. And he did that himself, and that was his first miracle. And he turned water into wine. And that was just one of it. Imagine going on a picnic with Jesus with a lot of people, say about 5,000. And out of these 5,000 people, only one person has bought a packed lunch. And everybody's hungry. Now, either that one person's going to get mobbed by 4,999 people, or, but guess what? Jesus intervenes, performs another miracle, and somehow those 5,000 people not only fed, but there was even food left over to spare. So that's the second example of his works. And imagine going to a funeral with Jesus, and the guy that's being buried, Jesus calls out to him. This was Lazarus. He called out to Lazarus, "Come out of his tomb." And Lazarus came out, having been dead. Seen by lots of people that he was actually dead. And Jesus turns up to a funeral and says, "Actually, no, come out, Lazarus." And he came out. And these are all things that are documented in the New Testament, which, as we said, is a foolproof document that has been backed up. But it wasn't just his miracles; it was also the way Jesus loved people. Jesus continually reached out, touching people in the society that had been rejected, lepers, outcasts. He transformed people's lives, and he's still doing that today as well. And most of all, he was willing to sacrifice his own life. Are these the deeds and doings of something that sounds insane or evil? Sacrificing yourself is not an evil trait, I don't think, anyway. The third thing was his character. The famous US magazine Time called Jesus the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness and love in the history of Western man. And then, of course, a real test is when we're under pressure, when we're in pain. And Jesus, in excruciating pain, when he was on the cross, he cried out, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they were doing." So this is a man who's been brutally beaten to the point of near death, where other people under such beatings would have actually died. So he was beaten to within an inch of his life, then hung on a cross, nailed up by his hands, and he still turned around and said, "Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing." Even in his greatest moment of pain, he still had the character to turn around and forgive them. I mean, how many times can we say that we've been hurt by someone, whether it be family or friends, and certainly in that exact moment of utter rage and anger, and this person's caused you hurt and upset, do we turn around and say, "Now forgive you"? We do something most of the time, hopefully anyway, after the events happened and we've calmed down and we're not quite feeling so upset, then we forgive people. But Jesus, even in his greatest moment of suffering, he still managed to forgive the people that were doing it to him. A British journalist, Matthew Paris, who describes himself as an avowed atheist, said this. He said, "I've got such huge respect for Jesus because his life was so radical, so inconvenient. If Jesus had not existed, the church most certainly would not have invented him." So even a devout atheist said that even the church could not invent this man. Number 4 was his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. And he actually fulfilled over 300 prophecies that were written about him before he was even born. Now some people say, "Oh well, he probably read them all and then thought, well, if I do those, then people will think I'm the Messiah, and that's the way I'll do it." But actually he couldn't do that, because a lot of the prophecies were about where he was going to be born, which I'm pretty sure he couldn't arrange. when he would die, how he would die exactly, all sorts of things that were kind of completely out of his control, and he fulfilled those prophecies that were written about him years and years before he was even born. The fifth thing was his conquest of death and his resurrection. And even Richard Dawkins wrote this. He said, if the resurrection is not true, Christianity becomes null and void. And that's very true, because it's a very crucial part of the Christian faith, that Jesus died on the cross and rose again from death. And the New Testament theologian Tom Wright put it like this. He said, the Christian claim is this: the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that the world has a creator, and that creator is seen in the terms of through the lens of Jesus. So he's saying again that the way to God is through Jesus, and that's all because of his death and resurrection. But then people say, well, okay, so what's the evidence? How do you know he was resurrected from the dead? And there have been many theories as to why Jesus' body was absent from the tomb, but none of them actually kind of hold any water. Because some people say, well, maybe Jesus didn't really die on the cross. Maybe he fainted from the pain, and then he miraculously got out of the tomb a few days later, having recovered in a nice, cool air of the tomb. Well, as I've already explained, most people died just from the brutal beating that he took, and then on top of that, he was also crucified, hung. And in John chapter 19, verse 33. They said, but when they came to Jesus and found he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Now, little did they know at this time that water in the blood indicates a separation, indicates the separation of the clot and the serum in the blood. Which is strong medical advice that Jesus was definitely dead. Okay, this is a medical term, a scientific medical term, that somebody is dead if they have water in their blood, and they wouldn't have known that at the time. But it's written in the Bible, so we can safely say he was dead and he did not faint from the pain. So some other people say, well, maybe the disciples stole him and they stole the body, and then began a rumour that Jesus had risen from the dead. Leaving aside the fact now that the tomb was guarded, which would suggest the disciples actually couldn't get in to take the body anyway, they put all their hope in Jesus, and he died, and knowing that Jesus' body was buried, why would they be willing to go back and take it away and risk everything for that when they knew he was dead? So that's not really going to happen. That's not really a waterproof theory either. Well, the next one is, well, okay, maybe the authorities took the body, but that's ridiculous, because if they took the body and then rumours started that Jesus had been resurrected, they could have just shown the body as proof that no, he's here, he's still dead, it's okay. But they didn't do that because they didn't have the body, so that doesn't hold any water either. Or maybe robbers stole the body. Well, actually, the only thing that was in the tomb that was of any worth to any robbers were the grave clothes, because they would have been filled with expensive spices. And when the disciples found the empty tomb, the grave clothes were still there. And that's the only thing that robbers would have been after if they'd have gone into the tomb. So that doesn't hold any water either. And then there's his presence with the disciples, and he did actually appear after his resurrection in a total of probably over 500 people over a period of 11 days. And is it really likely that all these 500 people are going to have the same hallucination and were all deluded? A little bit too much of a coincidence for all these different people over these period of 11 days to have all been nutcases. It's probably not true. And then there was the nature of his appearances. While they were still talking about about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And they were startled and frightened, thinking they had saw a ghost. But a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones. As you see, I have, Jesus said. They even gave him something to eat. Again, not a ghost-like thing to do, to eat things. It says they gave him a piece of broiled fish and took it and ate it in their presence. He even then later, on another occasion, cooked breakfast for them. So, he was actually back alive. He wasn't a ghost. He was actually appeared to these people. Now the other thing to suggest Jesus is right, that all this is true is people's Christians' experiences of Jesus over time. And lots of people, since Jesus died, have experienced him and had a relationship with Jesus. Is there anyone in the room tonight who's in love? Married people in the room?
If you're married, well, we can
Di, put your hand up now. You won't get smashed later. Di's in love. Good.
Boris Johnson.
My wife didn't put her hand up. That's slightly worrying. So it's a completely different experience to be in love, and it's something that you could do research into, a research document into in loveliness, being in love, and you could do a degree, a PhD on what it means to be in love. You could be a world-leading expert on love. But unless you're actually in love yourself, it's purely academic. And we would all accept that the best person to talk to about love would be somebody who's actually in love. So not my wife, but Di. Not my wife, Di, so don't talk to her later, talk to Di. Di's the only person other than me that's in love tonight.
I feel a bit sissy when you're
Oh no, did Kat put her hand up?
Yes.
She did, so there are three people in this room tonight. But yes, usually the best person to talk to about... Is there more people in love tonight?
My boyfriend's not over there. And for my number.
I just didn't see it, even though he didn't have his hand up. You couldn't see it because I was in the way. So, usually before we do something, we usually talk to somebody who's actually experienced that thing. So whatever, maybe we're thinking about going, I don't know, bungeeing off of a bridge or something. You might want to talk to somebody who's actually done it to find out what it was actually like. And the same for like being in love. The only way you can actually understand and what that's like is to talk to somebody who's actually in love, and then they can tell you what it's actually like, and it's wonderful. Trust me. My wife doesn't think so. But and that's what. So if you want to find out what it's like to have a relationship with Jesus and who Jesus is, then the best people to talk to are Christians and people that have actually experienced Jesus for themselves. If you're not quite sure, so you sat there thinking, well, what's this Jesus thing all about? Okay, so I understand a bit about who he was and what he did and all that kind of stuff, and what people thought about him and what he thought about himself, but I still don't quite get it. Well, the only way to find out more really is actually Christians will have different experiences with Jesus, and they'll have come to know him in different ways. Just the same as our relationships with each other, we're all different. We all have different relationships with Jesus. So the best people to talk to, really, actually, if you sat there thinking, I really want to know more, is to talk to somebody who's actually in a relationship with Jesus. Now, so when we're deciding whether all this is true and who Jesus is, there's a really good quote for this from the fictional character Detective Sherlock Holmes, who says, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." And as we look at the evidence of what we're speaking about tonight, about the way Jesus taught, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, we can probably eliminate that Jesus he wasn't insane. And we could probably, by the sounds of it, eliminate the fact that he was evil. So therefore, out of those three logical things that about whether Jesus was insane, evil, or the actual Son of Man, the only thing we're actually left with, Son of God, the only thing we're left with is the fact that he must have been the Son of God. C.S. Lewis put it like this: we're faced then with a frightening alternative. The man we're talking about was and is, just as we said, or else insane or worse. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither insane nor evil, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. And so that's the evidence for who Jesus is, and that he is the Son of God, that he is alive today, and that people are still having relationships with Jesus. And if you want to know more about him, then get to know somebody who knows him. And that's all I'll say.